So good morning. We will not get through the entirety of this lesson today. It is at least 2 discussions. It may be 3. That depends on you. But certainly for today, with the amount of ground we've got to cover and the information I want to pull out of the congregation, today we will be lucky if we complete the first part of this discussion. We're going to change the format up a little. We'll keep the 3 topics, but in order to get through the discussion, as I laid it all out, it became apparent that we needed to move the order a little bit. So for today, we're going to talk about tradition. Then we'll talk about Scripture and preference next week about the topic for today. So let's move into that. So again, welcome to today's class. We're glad you could make it. The rules, as it were, of engagement. So this topic is a little more internal. However, it is relevant when you talk to others about us if they're interested in that part of us. Depending upon where you're from and what your history is there are churches out there who have ongoing debates and positions about this topic. I don't think this congregation has a position. We're going to talk about that today and why. And then we're going to talk about how to discuss that with those who do. Do you have a position on it? Do you? If you still choose not to decide, have you made a choice? That's a Rush lyric. You do. All right, so the opening volley is that we in fact do have a building and a kitchen. And we have used the term fellowship hall. But all of that discussion will happen. So let's get after it. So we're going to start with tradition. And normally I would walk us through each one of these bullets, but I needed to get them all on the table so you could understand the context of where we're going. We're going to cover each one, and in the process, I think we're going to reveal a little bit of our history that some of you may not be aware of. So our restoration movement is only 190 years old. Does it sound weird to hear someone say only 190? We're lucky if we live half that. But compared to the history of, the church going all the way back to the first century, 190 years isn't that long at all. It's 2023, so we're talking 20% of the time, 10%. I don't know. I'm not going to pretend to be good at math this morning. So how long has Manhattan been a community? I think last year or the year before it celebrated its sesquicentennial. That's 170, by the way. I didn't know the term until you celebrated it, and then suddenly I knew the term. Does that seem old? Fort Riley and Manhattan are kind of born in the same period, right? Everybody's rushing west. There's things going on in the world. And we need a point on the ground to start kicking settlers westward. And this is a great point. It's flat. It's calm. Everybody can move through it. And later on, that's why we pave I-70 right across it. But again, only 170 years old. Did you ever realize that this city was only 10 years old when they decided to enact K-State? That's not old, is it? How many people were in town? 50? And they just let's make a college. We feel educated, let's start teaching others. I don't know how it all happened, but I know that very soon after people settled here, they made the college. And that has colored every opinion this community has made since then. So what do you get when you've got a military installation and a college together, with a group of settlers? Right, a melting pot's a good answer. You stole that from New York, but we'll accept because we're Manhattan, Kansas. And ever since, I mean, let's talk about the history a little bit, right? We're going back to the 1920s then. What happens in the 20s and 30s? The roaring 20s and then the Depression, and then after that it's war and war and war and war, and now you're in 1970. And in between there's the Civil Rights Act and some other things that happen. Huh? And then you have more war. That seems to be our national hobby. I'm a soldier, so you know, unfair of me to say where my position lies on that. But I'm not a fan. So, was there anybody around in any part of that? And I know some of you were, and we'll start picking some periods. My personal opinion, and what I'm asking you to validate, is that I think Manhattan was pretty shielded from all of that turmoil and tumult. I think that our position here in America is unique. Surely soldiers came and went. Surely students have come and gone. The Civil Rights Act happened. But when I look at our history, I can't see any exact times in which this city erupted in anger, angst, violence, confusion, or tears about it. Everything seems to just sort of pass us by in this sea of tranquility. That's odd. You're blessed. If you haven't figured that out, then know it today. Ma'am. Congratulations, we have protested. That's activity, I like that. Two protests in the Vietnam War. Sir. Yeah. So Burning, Kansas, if you're not familiar, and that's a little left of where I chose to start because this is a religious discussion. You know, Kansas was built upon the concepts of freedom. As Americans understand them, which really is, leave me alone and I'll leave you alone. You can say it a lot of ways, but when I get it into its fewest words, I think it's that. And I think that you can see that in Kansas today. People don't like laws that impact them, period. So just leave us alone. Trust us to do right and do right by you. So founded by abolitionists, yes, who wanted a free state. And I think you can see that thread throughout our history. So you live in a pocket of peace, more or less. Certainly a lot less than our brothers and sister states, right? They erupt over there in activity over what we would probably consider. So that's us. How many of us were born here and raised here? A handful? Yeah. In Manhattan or the greater Manhattan area, by the way, because the greater Manhattan community includes Ogden and Fort Riley and Junction City. And if you're looking out that direction, we're getting ever closer to claiming Wamego, and so it's a business district. So how many of us born and raised? Bonnie? Jake? 2. We're going to get to that. So your congregation, what? Who? Wesley was born here. He's how many weeks old? I love it. So actually, before we transition to the congregation, there's probably one more statement to make about that. I have heard it said that we watch our children leave to go find work right up until they have children, and then they return. Why is that? Maybe it's all that peace they remember as a child, all that lack of drama across their general area. So, congregation, 100 years old this year. Did you know that? It's right on the board out there if you do long subtraction. So we're trying to figure out as an eldership now how we want to bring that to you guys and celebrate that. We'll figure that out. We'll let you know. But 100 years. How many years in a generation? 40? You're biblical. I think that's a bit much. I think it's 20 to 25. The reason I say that is that seems to be the amount of years in which I can guarantee that people will have different opinions if they're born in those time frames. Everybody knows a 40-year-old doesn't think like a 10-year-old. But I see it, and that's also about when we start having kids. Somewhere 20 to 25 is the average. And we're stretching that a little bit to the right now, but as far as we can tell, that'll be temporary, and the overall norm will move back into the center. So, if we can accept that, then I can go with the math that I've already done in my head when I rehearsed. If not, if we want to go with 40, I'll have to do some math on the fly. That's always dangerous for me. I understand why you say 40. So if we go with 20 to 25 years, I'll stick with closer to 25. That's about the age that I wish people would start having kids. Any earlier, and I'm like, children raising children. 4 generations. 4 generations. So you are 4 generations old. Can anyone remember back 4 generations of people who worshiped here? I thought you might. Knew them or knew of? Okay, so we've got 1 point of information right there. And I was hoping that you would be here and we could use some of that information. I go back, I think, 2, maybe. We're going to find out right now. How many years between you and Bob? 20? Bob Meisner. How many years between you and Bob Meisner? How much older was he? Yeah. $25. 25 is a magic number. So, I'm 57. Are we in the same generation? How old are you? Come on now, yeah. No. I'm not asking any ladies here. I'm 57. Come with me. Where are we?
I'll be 73.
73. I was hoping it would be near that, but I didn't want to commit you to it. So almost 20 years? So Gene is the generation in front of me, close enough for our discussion this morning. Bob is the generation before Gene. That's as far back as I can go. And I didn't know Bob when he was young. I mean, Bob just used to put his 4 fingers fully extended and joined at me whenever he thought I said something wrong. That was the Bob I knew. And it was fun. I enjoyed that. And he had already stopped being an elder by the time I had got here. Huh? No? Was it an elder? I didn't even know my elders when I got here. I don't know what that says about me. That's as far back as I go. Who can go back farther than Bob? You guys. Can you go back farther than Bob? To your parents? Okay, because I knew your mom, but I never got to meet. I didn't have the privilege of meeting your father.
My dad's secretary was older than they were.
Was she first generation Manhattan Church of Christ?
She was here with it when the church.
Okay. That's right. I'm triggering memories here on the fly. So I think we might have someone who goes all the way back to the establishment of the church. Bob's secretary. No, your father's secretary. I was hoping you were going to say when the Campbells and the Stones were here, but that would have been a bit much. Okay. So, why is that important? Why is that 5 minutes of conversation important? How many of us know any of that? This congregation is more fluid than you think. And it flows just like the river. And we have to be careful with that because the tendency then would be to lose our continuity. I'm okay with the constant influx of new people. I'm okay with change at my age. That may change. I don't know. It seems to get harder as we get older sometimes. Sir?
Constantly need that next generation coming up, though, to keep the church growing and moving forward. I work with a guy that goes to a Lutheran church over by Wamego, and he's 65, 66 range. He's one of the younger people that goes there.
That's tough. So the comment made over there was, young people are important. They are. They're our continuity. They're the thread of our history moving forward. I would say maybe 1 out of every 15 people that pass through this congregation end up staying. 1 out of 15. That was my math last night when I added up the people and some numbers of people coming through. That's not bad. They have to choose to stay here and get jobs here and all that when they're from somewhere else. Sir.
Some of us, myself, were here for a little while, went away, somehow got sucked back.
Not somehow, we both know how. Because the people you love are here. That's why you're here. Am I wrong?
And an interesting perspective is, because I knew Bob and talked with him quite a bit, and then when I came back, just seeing all the changes, new faces, it was very interesting to see that.
If you go away for 5 years and you come back, and I say that because that's 2 rotations of military personnel and 1 graduation cycle of a brand new college student, 60% of the faces you see will be new. The rest of us will hopefully look the same, but chances are we'll look a little older. So we're more likely to lose our history than we are to maintain it, frankly. I mean, how much new information has already been revealed to you about how far back we can go and even our own age as a congregation? So we have to work to maintain it. This is where we're going to get into tradition. How do traditions form? All that just to ask this question. Is it? That's a way? Do we buy that? Traditions are formed by people doing something over and over and over?
Usually they start out of some necessity. There's some reason why we need to do something this way. And, at first it's different, but it seems like the best way of approaching whatever issue, whatever challenge we're facing. And then after doing it for a long enough period of time, it becomes a tradition.
Right. So I think time is the critical factor. So a humorous way to say what a tradition is, and then we'll talk about how they form. So traditions are when my dad tell me how I'm supposed to behave. Fair? So you have to listen to them first in order for it to be true, and then you have to be willing to do it. So, first generation of us, 100 years ago, they arrive, the city is 70 years old, and they form a church. Everything they do is not tradition. As far as I can tell from where they came from, they didn't bring them with them. If they had, you would be different. Because the whole purpose of this lesson is to talk about a tradition that didn't come here. So they were free thinkers, free-minded, the free state. And they left behind several of their traditions, and they came here to do a different thing. But the first generation that does something, it's not a tradition. It's the way they do a thing. Because generations are only 25 or 40 years old, that generation is still alive when the second generation picks up the reins of leadership. It's still not a tradition. I'm just doing what my dad taught me. I don't call it a tradition. I'm lucky if we even call it the way we do things. I just do it. Third generation, when my grandkids do it, that's a tradition. First time you can say you've got a tradition on the board is when they do a thing and don't know why. Why was the decision made? I don't know. So a joke about that condition. Family has a tradition of cooking the Thanksgiving meal in 2 separate pans. It's how we do it. People think it's a tradition. It's how we make our Thanksgiving meal every year. No one knows why until one year an aunt from out of state comes, and she tells us that there's nothing special about that. We do it because it wouldn't all fit in Mom's one pan. And we think it's how we have to do it. So it's like that. When we talk about tradition. So think about that, because that, who you are and what you are, determines what traditions you have and which ones you hold on to. Every generation, traditions attempt to form. It's whether or not we just choose to accept them and buy into them. So, how long have we been in this building, Gene?
20 years.
Not this part, the whole building. 67. And I'm taking that information as fact from the person who was the first couple to be married upstairs in that hall. Is that right? Within a month after. Is that why they rushed construction? They're like, we got to get Fred and Bonnie married in here. Boom. So there you go.
Mom was afraid the church would be finished in time to be married.
That's hilarious. So if you never knew that, know that. That's a living piece of our history right there. And we worship in that upstairs facility, which is really just that main hall, for 47 years. And then we built this addition down here 20 years ago, which was just paid off 6 months ago. Congratulations. 20-year commitment that you made good on. So 2/3 of our congregational history occurs in this building. 67-ish years? Okay. Okay. So half. A little more than half. How many other buildings have we been in? This is going to become important when we discuss next week and other days. 5, 6, 2? The answer is actually on the board outside. Which while they debate, I'll make a point with you about that. Every day you walk by the history of this church in 2 posters right out there. Stop and take a look. That's our history. How many buildings did we come up with? 2 that you know of. 3 places. So, half of our congregational life was spent here on this facility, and the entire other half, we were nomads, just bouncing from building to building to building as we looked for a home. Not unusual. Very first century Christian. Did we own the properties? Because not owning them would be perfectly first century Christian. We weren't allowed to own property. That becomes important later.
We did own 6 of those.
Oh, you not first century churchers. I don't know where those locations are. I couldn't pull those buildings out of a map without coming here and looking at the board that we have outside. So we're going to bring that back down since we're stuck on buildings. There's never been a time in American history in which Christians didn't worship in a building. How old's America? Almost 250, we'll give it that, maybe more. So in all the years of our country, we have always worshiped in buildings. Anyone who has ever worshiped in England, where most of our stock for America comes from, and Western Europe, has always worshiped in a building. Always. We're gonna get to some pretty exact dates here coming up. So it's all you know. Can you imagine not worshiping in a building? I mean, I've got an open-air cathedral. Fort Riley has an open-air cathedral you're free to use anytime you want. It is open to sky. And it's not bad. It's got plenty of concrete bleachers. We went out there for Kenneth's Eagle project and repaired some of it so many years ago now. And that's all fine and dandy during fine weather, right? Now imagine worshiping out there in the winter in a wet, rainy, snow. So that stunk as much then as it would now. And so we've always been in buildings. Remember that. So we're going to talk about the first part of Scripture before we get into the hard part of it next week, because we've still got a few minutes of time. So I find it weird, and now we'll get to the actual debate. Within our own body of worshipers, there are those who believe that we can't have a kitchen, and we can't use the word fellowship halls, and we can't have classrooms or any of that stuff. And the arguments have solidified pretty much as to why, and we'll discuss those. I find it weird that we debate what goes on inside a facility that I can find no scripture to support having. And that is their debate, that there is nothing in Scripture that says we should come inside this building and do anything other than worship. Now, if you think I'm kidding you, look on the internet, Church of Christ, buildings, drama. And it is alive today. All that point I made about telling you you live in a bubble of calm is why. Some of you, who even knows that this is a discussion going on out there in the greater Church of Christ community? All right, so I see the hands of some transients. So people who might get around a little bit. The men who brought me to Christ made absolutely certain that I understood their position. And they fully expected me to adopt it as their own. And they were against anything going on inside a building but worship. I was too new. I didn't pick up what they were laying down. I was busy trying to just get to know God. So I heard them, but it wasn't something that stuck with me because, frankly, I wasn't interested in traditions. I'm a nomad in more ways than most. I have no traditions in my family. I have no family history available to grab onto. The Army has made me a land vagabond. There is no place I call home other than near my wife. Wherever she is my center. And so I don't pick up traditions. I push against them. I wouldn't join any club that would have me as a member, is what I'm fond of saying. And so that stuff just doesn't stick with me, and it didn't. And I thought it was them just being them. It was a small town in Kentucky. But as we visited other churches, I would hear the discussion, whether the church had, as I think Gene said, we obviously have a position. But even if it was a position of ambivalence, they knew the discussion was happening. Since I have been in this church, I have met two people who have come and gone, who held this to be such an important topic that they chose not to worship with us. Two. It's not a lot. That's all I knew. There may have been others. I'm sure there were others. I don't know how large that population of people is, and I won't pretend. But we're going to meet them. We're going to greet them. We're going to have them here as guests. And if they're comfortable and confident enough to share their positions, we should be respectful. We should be mindful. But we should understand why we don't. That is the point of this discussion. They are free to accept it or not. You ever tried to force an opinion on someone? No, it doesn't work real well at all. In fact, more often than not, their heart becomes hard and they become angry and frustrated and turn away. So has anyone else met or been in a congregation? That's me. I'm me. The cheese stands alone. Thanks. All right, I got one person. Or that had that position about buildings, just so I can check our level of familiarity. Okay. So Lane and Elizabeth have been in a congregation where they didn't believe you should eat in the building. I'm okay with that as long as that applies to cars. I don't let anyone eat in my car. Not for not for religious reasons.
Congregations that I grew up in did not have kitchens. I don't know whether they were opposed to the idea. We did not. I don't know that any of them had meals in the church building. Maybe one of them. I can't remember. But one thing that was clearly communicated to me growing up was that we should not have Sunday school classes in our building.
All right. So I've heard that one also, and we're going to roll that. That's why I rolled all those up together. Kitchens, classrooms, coat racks, water coolers. Sir, you had one? Nope. Okay. Tawny? You were going. So that's a very hardline position. A congregation that said if you had a kitchen or if you ate in the building, you were going to hell. That's rough. I've been judged for a lot of things. Some rightly, some wrong. I would put that in the wrong category. Sir.
So the congregation we went to in Wichita before moving here, my grandpa was a preacher there back in the 80s. They built an entire new wing with classrooms when he was a preacher there. And it ended up causing a split when they decided to put a kitchen.
So the classrooms were fine, but the kitchen split the congregation. And that's the danger in this, is that we create reasons to divide instead of come together. And this has been a discussion ongoing for quite a long time. So I'm going to back it up, though, to where we started. Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. And that's the statement. So I agree that homes have kitchens. This is the heart of the debate, but they gave up the purpose of the discussion to adopt another one they could win, frankly. We're going to discuss that.
Back to what you said about having a kitchen, not only that, when we talk about eating, what are we doing when we take communion? We take and eat, as we said,
Now you're jumping ahead. We're going to talk about that next week because we're going to cover these two points here together, and then one more, and then we're going to run out of time as expected. So.
I remember a class a few years ago where this was brought up because a lot of people say, well, the Bible says we can't do it. And then there's people that say, well, the Bible doesn't say that we should do it.
So we say two things about ourselves. They're both listed right there. Am I wrong? We say if it's not in the Bible, we don't do it. And we are a first century church. That's not always the right answer together. Sometimes they are incompatible. And when we run into those dichotomies of logic, people's brains shut down and they start doing weird things like accepting that we can have a building when there are none in the first century church, but we can send people to hell for what goes on inside it. This is my problem with the discussion. Yes, ma'am.
Back to the church meeting at home, I can't find exactly where. I'm in Acts 2. We met in the temple.
Okay, so let's have that discussion. Here we go.
And then also in later on, I want to say Terania, I forgot how to get it right, where with me in a school or a public hall or something.
We're going to get there. So the discussion now is what did the first century church do and where? So, Jerusalem, where do we form? Where do we have our formation every morning of the first Christians formation? Inside the temple, specifically in the women's court. I guarantee you none of them ever got any further inside to that. They didn't go inside to the priest area, and they certainly didn't get to go in the temple. And that lasts just about as long as the Jewish community is willing to accept the fact that we are not them. And that ends very quickly, within a couple of years. And they boot them out of the temple. You can rinse and repeat that in every community that we go to where there is a Jewish population. That's what Paul does. Paul goes to the synagogue. And he meets first the Jewish population because he can. And as soon as they realize that he's disrupting the natural order of events, and where do we go? We go into homes. And whenever he goes into a community where there is no Jewish population, they start in homes. The important point of each one of those is neither one of them are church-owned. So we can't say that we as a congregation met on any ground we owned. It was voluntary. It was a gift. You can come meet in my house. The reason I make that distinction is because those who want to tell me what I can do inside the building make that distinction. They made it first. They say that church property can only be used for things that we see inside the first century church. Okay, by the way, the first century church owned no property. The God. Yeah, the Jews owned that. Same with the synagogues. So yes and no. We've got to understand how the government works. Tracy asked, wouldn't that be government property? The answer is a short yes, as long as there's a Jewish kingdom, because the king protects the temple. As soon as the Romans come in and they become just another province, there's a separation of church and state. And there is no way that the Jewish community has given up the temple until ultimately Rome just takes it and defiles it. That happens much later. We're going to get there. So, we are a vagabond people prior to 313. 313 should be burned into your collective consciousness as a Christian. That was the first year you were allowed to legally exist. The Edict of Constantine. Prior to that, even within our own communities, we're nomads. We're constantly moving around from one house to another. We have no home. We have a body of believers. We're not allowed to own property. And it is a rinse and repeat of peace and persecution and peace and persecution. And it depends upon where in the empire you are as to how horrific that is. Some governors get after that with a vengeance. Some don't. But you're not a legal entity. You're specifically not a legal entity. They deny you the right to own property as a Christian. So you got to be careful. That's when we get into the whole hiding and the fish symbol part. Where do we meet? It's a secret. It must be a secret if we are going to maintain our lives. So there's no church building. That's a false assumption up until 313. However, once we become the legal religion of the empire, it is monopoly. And every time the church can gather up enough money to roll dice, it is buying property. And it does it every day after that. And that's when it starts. That's when we have places to worship. And that's when the church is really formed as we understand the Catholic Church today. And oh, by the way, if you go inside any of those old ancient churches, of which really you can only find one these days, it's in Africa. Good luck on your search. Guess who lived there? The priests. Priests got to eat too, right? Okay. We'll go all the way back to the temple, though, because I love that one, because they always take me there when we have this discussion. You know what was in the very front of the temple? The altar of sacrifice. The single largest grill ever made. I don't mean to be disrespectful when I put it in those terms, but you got to understand what's going on there. 45 times a day, that thing is stacked with meat and offering, and it is burned to ash. That's how many times? Every day. Additionally, there are other areas in the temple where other sacrifices are going on all day that are not part of those 45. Those are the sacrifices where part of it is given to the Levites to eat if you're in the temple and you're working. When you're on temple shift, you don't leave. You live there. You still got to eat. And the Levites were authorized part of that. That's why they were given the skins from the 45 sacrifices too, so that they would have something to trade for food. Because in those days it had become a fairly stratified process for how it was going to happen. So they cooked. I think they cooked in the temple. It had a kitchen, if you want to get facetious. So we have been in buildings every year since 313. We've already had this discussion. You can't imagine not being in a building, can you? Well, how would you feel if you didn't even have a place to go and worship? Homeless? Spiritually, probably homeless, right? So we make buildings. Next week, we're going to talk about what goes on inside. I think we can all agree that we have always been in buildings as long as we can imagine, and that we're going to stay in it. But if you don't believe me that it's not in Scripture in the first century church, then do your homework. Come back and challenge me if you find it. I will go so far as to dare you. We did not worship in buildings in the first century. That the church owned is the caveat. Okay? We were welcome in peaceful people's houses. I've had people in mind for worship. I've been to others. I've conducted worship out at the lake in cabins. You can do it in a lot of places. But we've got to understand the argument before, and argument's a really bad word, but we've got to understand the position so that we can be prepared to have the discussion. All right? Sir?
Just occurs to me. So, Ray, I wonder how many people felt like they had to still go to church during COVID, even when everything was being televised.
Yeah, that'll be interesting. I think so. The statement from Fred was, I wonder how many people felt compelled to still attend worship physically, to be in a facility, in a place they knew of as church during COVID. I wanted to be here just because I wanted to make sure that we were all still here. So, I don't know. Time will answer that. Time answers all questions. Okay. Yes, ma'am. Yes, and that is the point of this, not to be argumentative or combative. I tried to have the discussion we're going to have next week with them about their positions. They didn't want to entertain the discussion, and I was okay with that. You know, blessings be upon you and be upon your way. We're always supposed to be kind, even when we disagree. So, okay. We're complete for today. We'll continue this discussion tomorrow. Thank you for your time.